I'm a little more overwhelmed than I thought I'd be. So welcome to the School of Aeronautics Convo Select. We're glad to have you here. In aeronautics, just like throughout university, but in aeronautics in particular, Christ followers are who we are. Aviation is what we do. So let's take it to the Lord in prayer. Father God, we just thank you so much for this this awesome day that you've given us. This every day is just a gift from you, and we thank you for that. We thank you for being our God. We thank you for loving us, and we just ask you to be with us this morning in this Convo Select. Bless this time. Be with our speakers. Open our hearts and our ears to what you want us to hear today. These things we ask in your holy name. Amen. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction. I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan Washburn, Professor Washburn, who's the program director for unmanned aerial systems. This Convo Select is focused on, well, just a whole bunch of stuff. I'll let them tell you about that. But it's brought to you by our Aerospace Technology Department. And so on July 1st, we created new departments, Flight Science and Aerospace Technology. We did this with intention. Aerospace Technology, the focus is to help prepare our students for what the aviation, the aerospace world is going to bring us in the next 10, 20 years and beyond. So as you go out into your careers, things are going to just keep changing. So we want to be positioned for that. We want to prepare you for those changes, and that's what aerospace technology is focused on. They have the degrees that are that deal with unmanned aerial systems, aircraft maintenance, and aviation administration. The aviation world is changing fast, it's dynamic, it's exciting, and so they're focused on really preparing you guys for that world, to be thinkers in that world, to be difference makers. Everybody knows pretty much, you see it in the news, we talk about it, that there's a pilot shortage. Major airlines, what we anticipate in major airlines is that up to 60% of the pilots in major airlines will retire in the next 10 years. What that means is in 10 years, over half the pilots will have less than 10 years experience. That's an aviation problem, maybe. Okay, so we want to prepare you for that. But what we don't talk about a whole lot is aircraft maintenance. We know that there are major airlines, they anticipate in the next 10 years that 80% of their maintainers will retire in the next 10 years. 80%. Think about that as you get on your airliner. All right, so with that, I want to do is get the program going and turn it over to John Washburn.
Good morning. Thank you, Dean Malloy. Thank you all for being here this morning. I'm very excited to tell you all about a project that's underway. We are currently developing something that we're excited to talk about today. We're hoping this summer to begin a center for autonomous systems and machines. This is in the works, so stay tuned for more on that. We're very excited about the future and to see autonomy become an accepted part of that future. And so some of the things we're going to focus on in that center are collegiate training in medium UAS. We have an incredible partnership with Textron Systems, and we get the opportunity to train four-year college students on a medium UAS platform and take them all the way through full certification, which is really an incredible opportunity and really only possible because of that partnership with Textron Systems, so thank you to them. We understand that sense and avoid is a big area of interest for manned aviation and unmanned. The manned aviators out there probably don't want to keep seeing all these headlines of unmanned aircraft approaching manned aircraft. It's just not safe. We also have a really interesting interest in human factors in unmanned systems. We are very excited about the idea of producing people from this program that can inform the world on what is safe and what is not safe and how to address risks in multi-UAS operations where you have one person who may be in charge of 50, 100 unmanned aircraft all at the same time. So that's very interesting to us to study. And building trust in autonomy. It really is a big question. A lot of people may have seen the posters that we put up for this convocation, and we asked, are you ready to trust a machine with your life? And that's kind of the question that we want to address today as we go through this program. So First up to talk to us today is Dr. Matt Vance. Dr. Vance comes to us from Oklahoma State University, where he's currently faculty member there, and he is an assistant professor in the Aviation and Space Department. He previously taught at St. Louis University from 2011 to 2015. He was a senior researcher there at the Center for Aviation Safety and was a flight instructor with the Center for Aviation Science. He has written or co-authored 11 peer-reviewed publications. That's a lot of work. He has given over 20 invited and peer-reviewed speeches and publications. Dr. Vance served in the United States Navy, where he accrued more than 3,000 hours of flight time as a navigator. He also is an FAA-rated airline transport pilot with over 2,000 hours of pilot time and 1,200 hours of instructor time. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Michigan. Anybody from Michigan? A Master's of Science in Aeronautical and Astronautical Engineering from Purdue, and a PhD in aviation science from St. Louis University. As his major research, he wrote a dissertation on the analysis of factors that may be essential in the decision to fly on fully automated passenger airliners, which is the reason that we have invited him to speak to you today on that topic. We're very excited to have him. We're very excited to discuss this today and to hear from him on that research on whether or not people are ready for this technology and what we may need to do to get there. So, Dr. Vance, please come on up. Please welcome Dr. Vance.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. It's an honor to have been invited, and I want to share a couple things about me first and address one vagrancy on the slides that you should see behind me shortly. I tell all my classes when I start a semester that this is who I am in the following order of priority: a Christian, a husband, a father, a naval officer, a pilot, and an engineer, in that order. So I just wanted you to know that's a little bit about me. The issue with that slide there is it should be an interrogative. It appears as a statement. It really should have a question mark at the end of that. And I think that it's very important when you do research to distinguish between exploring a subject and standing up and advocating a subject. I'm not ready to step on an autonomous airliner, but I am curious about the whole notion of the subject. So this really should have a question mark at the end of it. And lastly, if you've been up close to me or you can see my face on a video screen somewhere, we don't fight at OSU. My eye is impacted and I have a cut on my head because Friday, we do have winter there. And I fell on the ice trying to get the preheat carts out of our shed in order to fly and give a multi-engine lesson in one of our planes. And I fell flat on my face and my glasses smashed my face and I thought for sure I had ruined them. If you're a pilot, you know that I probably should have done the FAA I'm safe checklist and maybe not flown, but I did anyway because I really wanted to give the lesson to the student. But that's the reason I have a cut on my head and my eye looks like I've been hit because I fell on the ice. So try not to do that. It can hurt. All right, so let's get underway here. All right, so why study this subject? What's in it for us? There's a couple reasons I think that are worth looking at this. We understand how trust works in non-safety of life choices reasonably well, and our whole society went through a transformation on this where we started trusting your banking to the internet. You don't think about it anymore. We don't understand really how trust works in safety of life decisions. This is a very wide open space, and really what I was interested in exploring. That's one reason. Will human roles change in air transport? Yes, they will. I'm convinced that they will. They'll change dramatically. There's going to be some careers that are going to sunset. So let's get this out of the way right now, because you're probably wondering when. I'm wondering when. My personal conviction is, having looked at this topic, is it's probably 2 generations away still. So 2 generations in our country would be about 50 years. Why so long? Well, good news that it's that long, I guess. But number one, there's got to be a very strong preamble before there's going to be any sort of large transport category aircraft flying autonomously over populations. That preamble is likely to be cargo. Once that's done successfully and reliably for a while, then the second thing that has to happen is your FAA, which is very conservative, and in these matters this is something we should be thankful for, is not going to approve these operations until it's proven. So this is a ways away, about 2 generations. Your children, however, or your children's children, probably won't think twice about this. But for those of you who are entering aviation now, my gut is you'll probably have a full career. The thought of going to one pilot in an airliner concerns me far more than going to none. Because when it's time to go to none, we as humans probably will. But the thought of going to one, it just blows my mind, because I can't imagine how overwhelming it would be if you're there all by yourself and the machine starts to malfunction. Because then you've got no one else to rely on, no one else to commune with. So I think it's a ways away. But the air transport will change. And if piloting changes, so will air traffic control. Both of those careers will sunset, but new careers will manifest themselves. And they'll be very intense in computer technology, cybersecurity, optimization, and planning. So I actually think there'll be more people involved in air transport than there are now. They'll just be doing different things. If that's all going to happen, the public policy world has to follow suit. And our public policy structure in this country is a slow-moving engine, but it will follow suit, but it has to. So the whole notion of discussing this suggests, can we learn something that we don't already know? And that's why you look at these things, because maybe it will work, maybe it won't, but you want to examine it before you rush into something headlong. When I did this research in 2013, I had 312 airline pilots take the survey, of which I'm going to speak to you today. And the single most frequent comment from the airline pilots was the word inevitable. The question is when. So I don't have any issue with the idea that it's going to happen. I just don't know when. So let me set the stage. I want to tell you 3 little stories about trust. One involves very little notification, one involves 4 seconds of notification, and one involves about 20 seconds. What you need to be thinking about as you're listening to these stories is, where does autonomy play? Does it matter? Could it made a difference? So the first one, and those are the 3 right there, so we'll look at those. The first one is, it's been a long week, sometime in the future, and you're on your way home. You're running to the gate in the airport. You've passed through security. You're running to the gate. You get to the airplane, and you turn left, and you look in the cockpit, and there's no pilots up there. You think, oh, great. I'm not the last one here, so I didn't miss my flight. And the flight attendant says, oh, well, there are no pilots because this is our inaugural autonomous flight, and that should have been communicated to you when you purchased your ticket. And you stand there in stark horror, not knowing that that was going to occur, and you have a decision to make. Do you step off the boarding ramp onto the plane or not? It's a dichotomous decision. It's a yes-no decision. And if you do decide to step on the airplane, you have another decision to make, and that is, what are you going to drink? Is it water, coffee, or alcohol? And how much of it? Because this is what is going to happen at some point in the future. And do you trust? So in that case, you've been given very little notice. Do you have to make a decision? It's a no-go decision or a go decision. And if you go, do you sit quietly or do you take advantage of the libations on the airplane? But flying is a dichotomous decision. You either go or you don't. It's yes, no, open, closed. There is really no in between. All right, the second scenario, which is the value of 4 seconds. A little more notification, but still this is a trust scenario, a safety of life scenario. This is a schematic of the rail diagram in Chatsworth, California. This is 2008 now, and you have a train driver. This is an interesting preamble, a lone train driver in a train, not paying attention. What do you think the train driver was doing? Texting. It's texting. So the train driver is going north on the parallel track there. He's on the right track. A Union Pacific freight train is opposing him on the main line and is supposed to go on that siding that's illustrated there up at the north end of the picture. The train driver, because he's texting, blows through 3 red signals that are telling him to stop, because he's supposed to stop on the main line while the Union Pacific train pulls onto the siding and they can pass safely. But he doesn't stop because he's texting. He has his company squawk box turned down because he doesn't want to hear it. Because the company, the dispatcher, now sees what's happening and they're screaming at him to stop. He's not stopping. The last line of defense is the switch. Now, if you have ever played with or own model trains, you know what's going to happen if you try to run a train across an open switch. It derails. The train will fall off the tracks. Not so with a real train, because a real train has enough mass and energy, can drive right through an open switch. It just separates the rails, but it makes all this racket when the wheels click through the rails. Why does the train driver not hear it? He's texting, and he's got earbuds in. So that's the last line of defense. The train driver blows through the closed switch. There he goes. The Union Pacific freight train comes out of the tunnels. Oh, by the way, Union Pacific is trying to reach their crew too, but they can't because they're in these tunnels. They can't receive signals in the tunnel. That's a reenactment of what's about to occur. So there is the Union Pacific freight train minus its freight, opposing the LA commuter train with the same three bi-level cars that were on the train this day. The Union Pacific crew had 4 seconds. When they came out of the tunnel, they rounded this curve, they saw the other train coming, they had 4 seconds before the collision. Now it's interesting because research shows that humans take about 4 seconds to process a mortal threat, conceive of an action, and start to initiate that action. 4 seconds, it seems like a long time. If you've ever had this situation, you probably can emulate with this. The Union Pacific crew operated in advance of what the rest of us may have been capable of doing. They saw the threat, they processed the threat, they applied the brakes. It didn't work. That's what happened. So the Union Pacific engine, which is a GE locomotive, has far more mass than the Amtrak engine, obliterated the Amtrak engine. Train driver's dead. Reluctantly, it also obliterated the first car. You see there's only 2 cars left. So 25 people are dead, 1 train driver and 24 passengers, who all had implicit trust in a one-dimensional system. A train is a one-dimensional system. It's only got one motion, velocity. You know where it's going. You can't negotiate that. There's no altitude fluctuation. It's a one-dimensional system. So the question is there a possibility that autonomy could have made a difference in this situation? It's just something to think about. Here's another one. Does anybody know who that is? That's Sully. Yeah, that's Sully as an Air Force cadet. That's good. I don't know who said that, but that's fantastic. Do any of you own this book? Anybody? I do. Haven't read it all, but I own it. It's a good book. It's a historical text now, well reputed on flying. When I was starting my dissertation walk, I really didn't know what I was going to dissertate on, and a friend of mine from college sent me this article. Now, I don't read Vanity Fair magazine as a matter of course. Maybe you don't either. It's a pretty good magazine, I think. But that article came out in June of '09. What do you think it's describing? Given the Sully, that should be a hint, right? So it's describing the miracle on the Hudson. It's the water landing of US Air 1549. That is a very well-written article by William Langweiss, who is the son of Wolfgang Langweiss. It was well-researched, well-written, and it creates a postulation. And William basically argues, or lobbies, argues isn't the right word, he lobbies, we know where all the obstructions are, and we do. We know where all of them are to great infinitesimal detail. You can have a DTED database. We know where the obstructions are. We know how to compute the energy of an airliner very accurately. What if these two things talk to each other immediately? Would it have made a difference? Could we have computed a different flight trajectory than the river? So I thought, wow, that's fascinating. That, as an engineer and as a pilot, that was very intriguing to me. So I started doing a little digging. And I came across this from my alma mater, by the way. That transportation laboratory did not exist when I was at Michigan, but it's there now. They did the math. They computed the energy. And this is what was fascinating to me. When the birds hit the airplane, at that moment, there were actually 3 runways at LaGuardia that were within gliding distance of that A320. Runway 31 was preferred because of headwinds. After 8 seconds, that runway was no longer available, but there were still 2 other runways, 13 and 22. After 14 seconds, only runway 22 was available, but that lasted all the way out to 20 seconds. So the question is it possible that a computer could have computed this solution and effected it in less than 20 seconds? You know what the answer is. The computer could have done that in 20 nanoseconds. Now, I don't dispute, and I don't think anyone should dispute, the valor of the crew that dealt with this situation. I can't imagine what it would have been like in that cockpit with every single bell, whistle, horn, and flight control malfunctioning and going off. That crew probably was very definitely faced with the stark reality of a mortal threat in 4 seconds. They had to process and what to do with it. And they made, I think, a very excellent choice. The question, that is not the question, is not an indictment of the crew. The question from a piloting and an engineering perspective is, could autonomy have made a difference? And this was the final statement in that article by the author, the professor at the University of Michigan, is that her view was fully autonomous UAS operations are also an inevitable situation. It's only the trust. And I thought, wow, that's a pretty strong statement. So I called her. I picked up the phone and I called her. Cold call. And I asked her, have you done any further research on your last sentence in your article? Do you know about the trust? And she hadn't. So I thought, well, maybe I should do that. I'll try that, see what happens. Because I thought the whole notion of an autonomous airliner was really preposterous, frankly, at the time. So could autonomy have made a difference? Could it have made a difference in any one of these scenarios? That's really the question. So I set about a program to go research that. So these are the factors that I uncovered in the literature review, and then I'll show you some results from the dissertation. And then we'll go on and look at some other resources. And I've got a little graph in here that shows you it's called longitudinal trending, when you look at something over time and take multiple data points about where the propensity for this mode of travel might go. And then we'll just kind of wrap it up. So there's only one research question in my mind that was prevalent then, and it's still there now, is that there's a trust, safety, and a cost factor. All these things constantly interplay. Safety and cost are classic aviation tension points. Trust is a new one, because we trust aviation right now. But this is a different question now if you're taking the humans out of the loop. So those are definitions of unmanned and autonomous that I was using. They should be pretty congruent with what you've been exposed to. So unmanned means there's no human control. No one's controlling the vehicle from the ground. It's flying on its own. And autonomous means its entire movement is controlled by an algorithm, not by a human. So can these factors be quantified and ranked? I think that they can if you can find them. So I went looking at the trust literature. And these are the major points that I found in the trust literature. So the first one was reliability. And there's a direct relationship between the reliability of the automation and whether or not you have a belief that the positive outcome is in doubt. And if that's true, then your trust probably goes up. Trust will grow over time, especially if the behavior is repeated and there's only minor infractions or minor lapses. So that's a variable. I thought, okay, that's worth looking at. So I called that automation. The next one was assurance. Can you guarantee me that the thing that I'm going to do is going to work? Now, it's likely out of your sphere of reference, but there used to be a time when you'd walk into an airport, any major airport, and there was a kiosk there. And before you went on your flight, you could buy life insurance. There aren't any kiosks anymore. Why? Because we're not crashing airliners anymore. Thank goodness. But there was a time when you could buy life insurance on your way to your flight. So contracting guarantees have a great value in increasing trust if you believe in them or if you find them valuable. And it's interesting that the reputation of the people who represent the novel technology is also quite significant in this. So that seemed like something that was worth probing. Contracts and guarantees became a variable in this research. Then cost. Cost is always a factor in aviation. So can you save money? Possibly. But if you're going to invest in new technology, there's also the usual corollary that the cost is going to go down, and you ought to have a benefit from that. There should be a benefit to you. So it seemed like checking the ticket price made sense, so I looked at that too. Interruptions, small distractions can cause intense distrust, both in personal relationships and in technology. That's very related to the automation issue, but that was significantly different at the time. I thought maybe this was warranted its own variable. So systems interruptions became the fourth variable. Oversight. Well, we all live in a very heavy regulatory oversight environment. There's positives to that. There are some negatives, but overall, I think the positives far outweigh the negatives. But compliance behavior is that which others perceive to value, and we all have to demonstrate that if you want to be certificated as a pilot multiple times. You don't really monitor that either. When you trust something, you don't monitor it. You just go on about your business. So this seemed logical to me that we'd look at oversight and compliance behavior, so the regulatory structure was also a variable. History has a very positive outcome, and I mentioned a few moments ago that my conviction was going to have a preamble. Now somebody would say, well, what about cars? Why can't cars be a preamble? Well, they could, a driverless car. The problem is a driverless car doesn't have the third variable, doesn't have altitude, which creates a whole nother set of challenges. There are other things driverless cars are going to have to deal with, or driverless vehicles on the surface, like children or your pet, because you don't want to hit those either. But a history of positive outcomes is very valuable in investing in trust. So there were two variables that came out of this one. One was, how many years of cargo operations are you watching? And what's the safety record of those cargo operations? Because if it isn't good, then the whole idea here completely unravels. At least that's what I thought would happen. And this last one was the most important of all, because it was replete in the literature again and again and again. I summarized it this way. It's the integrity of the service provider. So whoever's providing the service, who's ever asking you to trust them, there are three things that have to be in order. One, they have to be able to display moral integrity, and you have to believe it. Because if you don't believe that, then the argument unravels right there. They have to have technical credibility. They have to be able to display and show that what they're asking you to do actually works. And they have a fiduciary responsibility to take care of their constituents if there's a problem. And they've demonstrated that. So I called that the integrity of the service provider. These variables were woven into the research and probed. And it was done in a story, a vignette. And stories are proven to be far more valuable in eliciting proper and honest behavioral reactions from individuals than just taking a Likert survey, which is sort of Sears good, better, and best, or from 1 to 5. Those surveys are acceptable, but story-based surveys seem to work better and give better answers. So I did a story-based survey. Here's an outline of the results. So there's 5 bins there that show the results in terms of the vocation of the group. So you have aviation on one side and non-aviators. On the pilot side, you have professional pilots and non-pilots. That's group 1 and 2. On the non-aviation side, you have science and math and non-science and math. Well, the science and math broke down between engineers and non-engineers, and then you had everybody else. So they weren't aviators and they weren't science and math. Those are the 5 groups. So here's the results. Now, you would expect that this group would be the least likely to be enthusiastic about this idea. But the opening question I asked before you even got to the survey, the opening question was something on the order of, given everything you know in your personal recognizance right now, would you step on an autonomous airliner? This was in 2013. That was a very broad but simple opening question. And I did that for a very specific reason. 20% of the professional pilots right out of the chute said, yeah, I'll get on an autonomous airliner. I go, wow. And by the time they were done reading the little vignette survey thing that I had woven into a sort of a future scenario, and I asked basically the same question again at the end of it, all right, now what do you think? The number had gone up to 32%, which floored me. Here's the engineers. Let's look at the engineers, the science and math-based engineers, and then the non-engineers that are in science and math disciplines. So the engineers started out at 30%. By the time they were done reading the little story, their acceptance of the notion had gone up to 45%. And this is the one that floored me, though. 53% of the non-engineers, when they were done reading this little story set in the future, they're ready to go. That's 6 years ago. That's in 2013. And these numbers just didn't make any sense to me. They were incredible. So here is the summary of the entire research in one graph. There's the 8 variables I showed you, and this is the impact they were having. So the vertical axis is the impact on your propensity to travel on the airliner. So if the percent is how much more would that variable have influenced you? So each variable was set at a positive or a negative level in the research, and the story reflected that. So you were given a story with the 8 variables, each one woven into a paragraph. And some paragraphs had a positive level, some paragraphs had a negative. It was all a big script. And you didn't know which story you were given, you just read the story and reacted to it. But this is what it showed. The integrity of the service provider, not by a large margin, but was the dominant variable. That was the one that mattered the most, the human nature of the issue. The automation, sophistication, and the system response to interruptions, which I think are very closely coupled, were number 2 and 3, and closely followed the service provider. Then you can see the rest of the variables. The interesting one is the life insurance and contract guarantees. That one was rejected. It negatively influenced whether the level was set positively or whether the level was set negatively. No one liked it, and I'm convinced it's because no one sees a kiosk anymore and has any idea about life insurance for airliners. And I also think the levels of the variable were set too aggressively. So, for example, the negative level was if you traveled on one of these things and you died, the company would pay your family $6 million. That was the negative level. And the positive level is they'd pay you $60 million. And I think either of those numbers are so large as to be uncredible. And they weren't arbitrary. The lower end, by the way, if you look at our government structure, it depends whether you look at Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, Department of Agriculture, all the major departments of our government have set a value of your life. You didn't know that, but they have. And it's not the same number. But the rough average is about $6 million. A human life is worth about $6 million, according to the United States government. That's where that number came from, but it was wholly rejected. The other thing that this graph shows is there were 2 different ways that I examined the data. The frequentis-based sounds like frequency because it is. It's just a means-based. You take all the data and you average it. It's actually a weighted average, but it's an average. The Bayesian-based method, I think, is more valuable because it's dichotomous. It's yes, no. So I gave the respondents a little slider bar. They could move a little slider from 0 all the way to 100. So 0 means absolutely not, and 100% means yes, I'm committed. I'm willing to do this, and you could choose anywhere in between. So I just cut it in the middle. At 50%, if you scored between 0 and 50, that was a no. No, I'm not going to fly. 51 to 100, yes. So I cut the data 2 different ways. But I think the Bayesian method is more valuable because it forces a dichotomy, which is indicative of the choice we're discussing here. So that's the spread of the variables. That's how they played out. So if you were to look at that, you probably would want to pay more attention to the variables that are rating positively than those that are rating negatively. So notice that the federal regulatory structure was essentially discarded, didn't matter, no one cared. Curiously, the unmanned cargo safety record also didn't seem to matter much, and I was kind of curious about it. I didn't understand that. I think I understand why the contracts and guarantees were so negatively influential. It's just because they weren't credible. So we just talked about that. So let's look and see how history has treated this subject. When I started this walk with that Vanity Fair article, I went back in the literature and I found this McSween-George study from 2003. This is the first and earliest study that I could find that directly probed on whether or not anyone would walk on or board an autonomous airliner. So McSween-George was a McDonnell Douglas employee. She stood inside the security barrier at LAX with a clipboard and surveyed 200 international travelers. And she had 4 groups of 50. Each one was given a different introduction. You can see the sort of the sequential series of introductions there, but they all had the same follow-on questions. And the 4th question was this one: would you fly in an autonomous aircraft? So the overwhelming response out of 200 survey results was no. 44 were not sure, but most of them said no. That leaves this number that said yes. That's 10.5%. Even that surprised me in 2003. 10.5% of the people were ready to go. Here's my results. There's the slider bar I told you about. There is the means-based result. There's the dichotomous-based result on the opening question. That's the overall average of everybody, not just the pilots. There's the closing question at the end of the survey, and you can see the numbers went up. These are big numbers in my mind, fascinatingly big numbers. Here is the same result in a Bayesian statistical presentation. So the question is, that curve represents the hump represents the locus of points if you're willing to travel. So that's the McSween-George hump at 10.5%, and that's across the vertical axis, and the probability distribution is on the vertical axis. The question is, as you ask the question again or look in time, does the hump move or does it stay there? Well, with the opening question in my survey, it moved to the right. More people were ready to go. And it got narrower, which means the validity of it increased. And at the end of the survey, it moved further to the right. And the standard deviation narrowed again, so the reliability went up such that 35% of the people answering this survey said, yeah, I'm ready to go, given the conditions I was offering, which just is floored to me. So the conclusion I drew was that 10 years appears to have influenced this notion positively. I did hypothesize that passengers would be younger, and that was the case, not too surprising. I did hypothesize that non-science and math people would like to do this. I was definitely wrong about that. I also thought people with less than no college education would be more willing. That was wrong. It turns out that bachelor degrees were the least willing, and PhDs were willing, and high school graduates were willing, but not in the middle. And I also thought infrequent travelers would be willing, and that seemed to be the case. I just redid this survey in a different format, a slightly different format this past spring with a student researcher at OSU. This graph shows on the horizontal axis, there was only 9 vignettes this time, not 16 like there was before, but the vertical axis is the percent that are willing to fly, and the green is the the closing question, and the red is the opening question. So the variables reduced to this. We decided to cut the variable space down to 4. And there's some rationale for that. But here's the bottom line. 48% said yes on the opening question. So here another 5 years has gone, and the percentages are going up. Here it is longitudinally. There's the 4 data points that I've told you. There's 2 more. Tam from Purdue did a survey with only 158 people, but the U.S. Bank in Switzerland did 8,000 people, 1,500 U.S. Well, there's the trend. Now, the sample sizes are not the same. The demographics are different, so there's a little bit of discussion here. It's very U.S.-centric. That is considered across these, but there's the trend. Now, to be fair, ALPA did a survey last year in August. They didn't publish the results of who was willing. They published the results of who was unwilling. And it's ALPA. So what do you think the results were? 81% were unwilling. So there is a difference of opinion here. But I think this is fascinating to me that there seems to be a ramp up here in people who are willing to do this. And these are the most conservative views. These are the most conservative views from all the data I have. I could have plotted the more aggressive views, and the graph would have been even more acute. So here's the result of the comments. Human presence. The people that took the survey, 231 of them stated they wanted to know who, not on the airplane, but who in the company was responsible for their travel. I thought that was a fascinating comment. And they also asked, what are the alternative modes? You asked me to go on an autonomous airliner. What else could I do in the future? Is there a maglev train available? Is there a personal air taxi available? Because you didn't tell me, you didn't give me any other choices, you just said an autonomous airliner. Fair enough, I didn't, you're right. Didn't give me an evacuated tube choice. They endorsed the whole notion, and it's interesting because the automation, and it's interesting your dean just briefed, inexperience. But automation was preferred over inexperience. And the inevitability already mentioned by the pilots. Cybersecurity was a huge concern, and it's still a number 1 concern. This is interesting. You know, it wasn't the airplanes that killed the trains in this country. It was the automobile. And the same thing could happen with airliners. If you could fly a personal air taxi, would you take an airliner? If you could land a personal air taxi right out here, would you take an airliner and go where you want it to go? I think the implications are very strong. There was a distrust of the U.S. government, but notice the number of comments is going down now, and of course there was rejection by the airline pilot community, as you would expect. Some of it very vile, as you would expect. So the summary of this is human responsibility is valued more than technology. I don't think that's ever going to change. If we can't take ownership of something, you're not going to trust it. It's just that basic. The survey that I showed you ended up with 4 factors that seem to be important, 1 very negatively. I already talked to you a little bit about the demographics. It does appear to me that the affinity for this notion has grown, which is amazing to me, but it does appear to be growing. But you can't trust technology without the integrity of the service provider in place. There's no way that's going to happen. And I want to thank you because I see red numbers on that board, which means I'm over my time, and I apologize. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, thank you, Dr. Vance, for that great insight into where we're at in humanity with our trust and autonomy. It's interesting, it's good to hear, and good to see that there's a lot of work to do in that, and we hope to address that in the future here at the School of Aeronautics and the Center for Automated Systems and Machines. Next up, I'm going to introduce Mark Blanks. Mark Blanks is currently the director of the Virginia Tech Mid-Atlantic Aviation Partnership. Previously, Mark was the program manager for unmanned aircraft systems at the Applied Aviation Research Center at Kansas State University. Under his leadership, the UAS program became one of the fastest growing programs on the campus and a top priority of the university. Mark has a strong background in technical disciplines. He is FAA airframe and power plant rated. Shout out to all of our AMTS students. He is a private pilot with instrument rating. He has held a variety of positions in the aviation industry. He has worked in flight testing and aircraft certification. Mark serves as the chairman for the ASTM F3802 subcommittee, which is the Committee on UAS Flight Operations. ASTM works to build standards that inform the government and industry on how to do things safely, like operate unmanned aerial vehicles over people, operate them in combined airspace where we have manned and unmanned flying together. Mark previously held a nationally elected position on the board of directors for the Association for Unmanned Vehicle Systems International, or better known as AUVSI, which is the world's largest association for unmanned systems. And we're excited to have Mark here today to talk to us about some of his research, so please join me in welcoming Mark Blanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan, for that thorough introduction. I appreciate it. So good to be here, and what a beautiful place. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the technical challenges of autonomous systems. We're going to dive into a few different areas there. But first, let me just tell you a little bit about what we do currently. I'm the director, as Jonathan mentioned, of the Mid-Atlantic Aviation Partnership at Virginia Tech. And MAP, as we call it for short, means basically I get up every day and get to go have fun breaking stuff. And that's literally what we do. We test and evaluate all kinds of things. We've crashed drones into dummies. We've crashed drones into the ground, sometimes on purpose, most of the time. But basically, we get to try out the newest, latest, greatest, coolest thing every day. So it's a lot of fun. I will say, though, that all that glamorous crashing of things, it may not be glamorous always, but all that is really built behind safety. We are actually looking at what does it mean to be safe. And we're going to talk about what it means to be safe with an autonomous aircraft as well. But if you ever get really bored, if you ever get just so bored you can't stand it, you want to have a lot of fun, the best thing you can do is go find a big group of engineers, stick them in a room somewhere, and ask them to define the word autonomous, and see what happens. You'll find out that there's more definitions for the word autonomous than there are people, and that nobody can agree. And I've actually had to live through this. I lived through a 3-hour conversation trying to define the word autonomous. We're not going to try to do that today. But what I do want to note is that, in general, autonomous systems means that the system is making its own decision. It's no longer the pilot making the decision, it's a system. Now, I'll also use the word highly automated. FAA tends to prefer the word highly automated versus autonomous. When we talk about automation, one of the easiest things for me to remember and to keep track of is looking at the driverless car world, which there were some mentions of before. SAE, the Society of Engineers, Automotive Engineers, I believe, created a 5-level scale of automation, from 0, no automation, to 5, full automation. 1 and 2 are like driver assistance and partial automation, think cruise control, adaptive cruise, lane keeping. We're seeing that quite a bit now, as well as conditional automation, and then high automation, and then full automation. But conditional and high is where the driver is now starting to monitor the system and no longer actively drive the system. And as we'll touch on a few other things here in a minute, that is probably the most dangerous situation. It's also the most dangerous situation on an airliner or on an unmanned aircraft where you have a pilot monitoring it, because they're expecting the pilot to stay engaged all the time. And when the system fails, they can immediately pick it up and run with it, and that is extremely hard to do. So we'll come back to that when we talk about different levels of automation. But automation is not new, or autonomy is not new to aviation. I mean, we've had autopilots for 50, 60, 70 years now. But now we have flight directors and flight management systems that are doing all kinds of basically flying the aircraft. Once again, asking the pilot to stay engaged on the loop. Unmanned aircraft have been ranging from remote control aircraft where you had just a RC sticks to where now you can push a button, it flies its whole mission, comes home, you never had to touch a thing. You may not even be able to touch a thing. That's starting to get there too. But we also have a new concept called urban air mobility. I don't know if you've ever heard of that term or not. Urban air mobility is the idea of the Uber in the skies. You call the taxi, and the aircraft shows up and delivers you somewhere. Uber's investing in this a lot. Airbus is investing in it. Funny thing is, we've had urban air mobility for a long time. It's called helicopters. However, that hasn't really worked out as far as an air taxi, right? Because nobody can afford a $1,000 commute to work. But imagine if it's $10 or $20. That might be possible. And the technology is getting there, and it's envisioned that the autonomy will make that happen, along with distributed electric propulsion and some other things. But it may not be as cheap as we might think it will be one day. And then eventually we will have the autonomous airliner piece. Before we dive into the technical challenges with autonomy, I want to just talk briefly about the technical challenges with humans. We don't have any of those, do we? So humans typically don't perform quite at their peak all the time. Have you ever been flying in air? We have a lot of pilots in the room, right? I hope we do. Some nods. Okay. So if you're flying around in airspace and you're 172 and you're looking outside the window, I'm just curious if anybody has any clue of how often they think they identify all the aircraft that are flying around. Do you see every aircraft that's flying? Probably not. An MIT study back in the late 80s found that only about 56% of the aircraft were identified. So that means half the aircraft flying around you don't see unless you're alerted by air traffic control or some other system, TCAS or whatever else it may be. So we're missing half the aircraft that are flying around just with our visual eyes. How good does a detect and avoid system have to be? That's a question we'll come back to in a minute. Also, fatigue. We get tired. We get distracted. Nobody ever gets distracted in the cockpit, right? 10 years ago, there was 2 pilots that flew an aircraft 150 miles past their destination because they were playing around on a laptop. There's a crash that happened in the 70s where they crashed an airplane into the ground because they were so busy troubleshooting a burned out landing light that they failed to realize the autopilot had disengaged and crashed and burned. Distraction is not a small problem. We also make bad decisions, sorry. We also have problems with what we call mode confusion. You ever set the cruise control in your car and think it was set, and then all of a sudden, why are we going so slow? It's because you didn't realize it wasn't actually set. Or you think the autopilot's holding airspeed, it's actually holding altitude, or vice versa. It's holding airspeed, not altitude. Mode confusion is another huge problem. Humans do not perform 100% of the time. But now let's talk about autonomous systems. What is the expectation there? So this has been mentioned a couple times already, sense and avoid or detect and avoid. That would be the problem that is the closest range. We'll talk about that for a minute. There's a bunch of others we're going to touch on. But detect and avoid is the idea of being able to detect or see other aircraft in the airspace the way that a human would do. All we really need to do is be 56% reliable to match the human, right? But it becomes a lot more challenging than just detecting and avoiding. This is what people focus on is how hard it is to see the other aircraft. But really, the avoiding part is just as hard, if not harder, than the seeing it. Because not only do you have to see it or detect it, now you have to understand what it is. Is it a bird? Hopefully not. It's an airplane. How fast is it moving? Where is it going? Is it stationary? Is it on a trajectory to interfere with me? What is my trajectory, and what kind of performance does the aircraft I'm flying have? And now what maneuver do I need to make in order to avoid the other aircraft? Not only avoid it, you don't want to just you don't want to just clip a wing. You've actually got to avoid it. So there's a definition called well clear. We need to maintain roughly 2,000 feet from the aircraft. So when we talk about detect and avoid as being a really hard problem, it's not just detect, so don't get locked in on that. It is the entire process of avoiding the other aircraft. At MAP, we've tested most all of the systems out there that are designed to do this currently. And what we're finding is they simply don't work quite as well as we like for them to. So there's radar systems. Radar is probably the most popular one right now. We see a lot of radars. Radar's been around forever. It must surely work. It's been around all the time. But radar works good in the clouds. It works good at nighttime. It doesn't need any particular conditions. However, radar has to be able to classify something as a drone, as an aircraft, not as a bird, as something else. Radar has to be able to track it. Radar also, when they first put it on aircraft, you're talking about taking off, going up to altitude and flying around. Unmanned aircraft and the urban air mobility type aircraft are flying at much lower altitudes. And now we're picking up dump trucks and trains We've spotted more dump trucks from an airplane than you could ever imagine with the radar, because now that's in the field of view of the radar. So now we have to be able to separate ground traffic from air traffic. Never would have thought that would be a problem, right? So one of the solutions is we'll stick the radar on the ground, we'll call it ground-based detect and avoid, and then we'll just surveil the airspace from the ground. That's great, but guess what? Your aircraft flies out of it, so now it only works for a certain small volume. At the end of the day, the results that we're seeing is about 50 to 70% of the time, a radar will track another aircraft. So that means they're as good as a human is, but guess what? Probably not good enough for the FAA. In fact, the industry developed a standard that said the radars must track 95% of the time. And I think that's actually a pretty good metric. But right now, we're not seeing any aircraft that are anywhere near that. Or any radar, sorry, that are anywhere near that. So we're not quite there on detect and avoid yet with radar. There's also optical systems. Those things are great. They're lightweight, they're low cost. All you gotta do is a camera. You think of a problem with that though? Think of clouds, weather, poor visibility. Suddenly that becomes a problem. Another one you may not think about as much is as soon as the object goes below the horizon, the cameras have a hard time telling it apart from the ground once again. So there's also systems that are acoustic. And this is amazing science to me. We can take acoustic systems, stick it on an aircraft, and that acoustic system can basically eliminate its own ship noise, the own noise of the engine and motor, and then just look for ambient noise and spot aircraft 10, 15 miles out acoustically. How cool is that? It's also a little lightweight, like 300 grams, doesn't take hardly any power. But guess what? Acoustic systems also are affected by wind. And they work really good to tell you where something is, to point you in the direction, say it's over there. But what they don't do as well is how far over there is it? How far away is it? We call that bearing and ranging. They're really good at bearing, they can identify where it is, but they have to range it to figure out how far away it is as far as being able to avoid it. The bottom line to you is, detect and avoid is such a big problem. People out there have a lot of solutions, but none of them fully meet the bar of being able to avoid all the time. We'll come back to the all the time piece in just a moment. So what we believe is we're going to end up seeing some kind of layered mitigation. You can have multiple types of sensors or other technologies together. But another issue that's probably just as big as detect and avoid, if not bigger, is cybersecurity. Now, we've talked about this some, you may have heard about some with current manned aircraft. Cybersecurity is important. We have a link between the aircraft now and the ground. But when there's a human in the pilot to back it up, it's not quite as big a deal. Somebody hacks it, okay, well, the system doesn't perform as well, but you can take it over. With an autonomous system, if it's hacked, it could be hijacked from the ground and something nefarious done with it. So let's just say that we bulletproof the system. We make it so that nobody can cyber hack it. We're never going to quite get to 100% though. We'll be 99.99999% hack proof. What if one single aircraft were hijacked from the ground? What if one single urban air mobility, one helicopter, one airliner, or somebody else was hijacked from the ground? What would that do to the confidence of the public, knowing that a terrorist could hijack your aircraft without ever stepping on board it? Now, what if they could do that for the entire fleet? So just talk about even perception and confidence issues. Cyber is a huge one. What about navigation? Right now, we navigate almost exclusively by GPS with unmanned aircraft and with most autonomous systems. But GPS can be taken out. It can have all kinds of error-prone issues. What's the backup to it? There's optical sensors that look at the ground. There's a bunch of other ones, and none of them work real well. So just from a technical standpoint, navigating can become very, very difficult. And reliability in general. How do you know the system is not going to fail? How do you prove reliability? You know that proving reliability in flight tests is one of the hardest things we do. Because what does it mean to be reliable? If you go out and do something 10 times and it never fails, no problem. If you go out and do it 1,000 times, it doesn't fail, no problem. What if it fails the next 10 times after the 1,000, though? Proving reliability is very difficult, even probably for your friends, perhaps. Well, maybe some are better than others. But proving reliability, you have to build trust over time. But if you don't know what the decisions that system is going to make because it's autonomous, proving that reliability can be extremely, extremely difficult. And then just decision making. I think that Dr. Vance touched on this before. Will an autonomous system make the right decisions? So we have the driverless car model once again. With a driverless car driving down a road and a kid steps out in front of a driverless car. Can it avoid the kid? Probably so, yes. Now a kid runs out and a dog runs out with it. and it has nowhere to go, it has to hit one of them, can the driverless car make the best decision? Now, 2 dogs run out and a kid. Kind of those things. You get 2 for 1. You got to take 2 dogs or 1 kid. Which one's the best choice? The system has to be able to place value on outcomes, figure out what is the best decision to make, and understand that sometimes there is no good decision, but there is a better decision to be made. And right now, I don't know that we've seen a lot of that logic combined with sensors that are capable of doing all that together. So we would need to classify a kid, identify his value. You just imagine how difficult that becomes and how quickly. And then just what happens when the system fails. When the system fails, if it fails, and somebody ever gets hurt, who's to blame in an autonomous system? And where is the backup? There is no human backup. So we start talking about trying to certify unmanned aircraft or autonomous aircraft. Every, 172 you're flying around, Seminole, whatever it may be, airliner, those are all certified, there's some regulation. How do you certify an autonomous system? I had the pleasure last year of attending a workshop for 3 days and listening with the FAA. There's all FAA people and a couple of industry folks trying to brainstorm this question: how will we certify highly automated systems? And after 3 days of grueling, intense sessions, you know what my takeaway was at the end of it? Who knows? We don't know how to get there yet. It's not quite that bad. But it is still, there's so many questions remain. We don't know how to certify a system that we can't explain what it's going to do next. One of the concepts is to safely bound it. So this idea is to say, here's a box that you have to live within, system. And if you stray outside that box in any way, shape, or form, it's going to push you back in. You can make any decision you want to make as long as it's within this box. That's bounding. But that becomes really hard when you have thousands of subsystems and tens of thousands of choices and decisions, and now that bounding it, and what is the correction system? Bounding even in itself becomes hard. But I do believe we'll get there at some point. And it's probably going to be based on basically mitigating risk. What we do at our test site is primarily with commercial entities. We have companies come in and they want to go fly and do some flight that FAA won't currently allow them to do. We help them build what's called a safety case. We take that flight that they want to do, we identify all the possible hazards. What are the bad outcomes? Mid-air collision with another aircraft, collision with the ground, collision with people on the ground. And we identify what the risks are. What are the things that could fail that would make that happen? And then we identify mitigations. We call them mitigations, or basically things that prevent that from happening. And we might have 3 hazards, mid-air collision, ground, and people, and have 500 mitigations, or 100 mitigations, it just depends. And each one of those mitigations, though, is going to reduce the risk, and eventually we're going to get to a low level. But we have to go out and collect data to show that those mitigations work. And the same thing is going to happen with unmanned aircraft certification and autonomous aircraft certification. We have to prove that the mitigations, in this case, logic of a computer, will mitigate the risk. But at the end of the day, one of the primary problems is going to be, as Dr. Vance talked to, public acceptance. We can prove the system is safe, 100 times safer than a manned pilot. And I think we could probably actually get to that point. But if the public doesn't accept it, then certainly this technology is not going to go anywhere. Or, here's another possible problem. We have 1 crash every 10 million flight hours, or 100 million flight hours, and what is the liability? Who does that go back to? When the aircraft doesn't work, somebody gets hurt, where does it go back to? And as soon as, they can't go to a human pilot, as soon as they go somewhere next, they're going to go to the company that manufactured the aircraft. And so there's a huge liability problem about, can a company, can an Airbus, can a Boeing, can any of these companies survive the liability of actually hurting someone with an automated system? Now, what if you crash an airliner full of people? So if nothing else, there's always the possibility that the liability issues could kill this, even if the public acceptance works and even if the technology works. And from a public acceptance standpoint, it's all about value. It's all about, is the value worth the negative? I say this all the time about cell phones. Would I have been willing to tolerate a tracking device 24/7 with me all the time, everywhere I went? Back when I was in college, that was not yesterday. And the answer to that is I would absolutely not have been willing to do so then. Now, every day I carry my cell phone, and every day it tracks me, because I perceive the value is far greater than the negative. Same thing is true autonomous systems. Would you be willing to tolerate a little bit of risk, a little bit of concern for a 10-minute commute to work versus a 2-hour commute to work. We'll see where that plays out. But I do know that culture is changing, and this has been mentioned earlier as well. My daughter is an example of that. This past year, we get to do a lot of fun stuff, and we were fortunate last August to have package delivery right to our house, right in our front yard, by drone. And so for about 2 weeks, my kids every afternoon went outside, got on a cell phone, ordered a popsicle or an ice cream, and it showed up right there 2 minutes later. Talk about creating expectations you can't meet as a dad. It's really a bad idea to do that. But I asked my oldest daughter, I said, honey, what do you think about being a part of history, this historic moment? And how does it feel? And she said, Dad, this is just normal. You do this every day. What's the big deal? To her, this is normal. Automated systems showing up, delivering popsicles and ice cream, which, by the way, I wish I had when I was a kid, is normal to some kids. And it's moving that way rapidly, so I think we certainly will get there. But if you were to ask me the question that I get asked all the time, will I step foot on an automated or autonomous aircraft? I will tell you, no way on earth. I've seen way too many of them fail, seen way too many crashes. But now give me a decade or two, we'll talk again. But we're not quite there yet. So with that, that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Mark. That was incredible. So in closing, can we thank them one more time for coming out and speaking to us? Thank you guys so much. If you would like to ask them questions or just meet them, they're going to be down here and would love to meet some of you after. If you have any questions for them at all, have an amazing day, and thank you for coming out.